I'll just start from here then, and we can introduce our guests today, Allison Katz and Matthew Krishanu. And we're going to have an in-conversation today with some of our BA painting students from BA Fine Arts Painting Camberwell College of Art, UAL. So we're going to begin by looking at Imogen's work. And so I'm going to invite Allison and Matthew to offer some thoughts and feedback. Allison, I know that you were having a look at Imogen's work this week, and I wondered if we could maybe begin with you.
Well, I was really struck, Imogen, by the use of kind of the moving image inside painting, because through the use of transparency and perspective, you're really destabilizing some of the usual narrative of an image. And I thought, you know, it's really striking, this idea that you're looking down through water. So, you know, the repetition, the transparencies, the overlaying, it's all kind of time-based techniques. And this really elemental thing that escapes time is being frozen by oil. You know, this contradiction of kind of trying to show water with oil and the blurring of a specific fixed moment. And I wondered if you could speak maybe a little bit to how you think about the elements that contradict sort of painting's weight.
Yeah, I mean, like, painting's such an interesting thing for me because obviously, like, it's pigment, which is this solid material mixed with this fluid substance, which is the oil. So it's always going to be this interesting relationship between, like, conveying, like, both solid and like subject matter, but also I guess everything solid has like movement, like physically in the world anyway, so it sort of reflects that interesting sort of paradox maybe, that things that we think are solid are actually in motion and in movement, and nothing is ever still. With the kind of like, I'm quite interested in that fragmented imagery and that kind of the element of water. Obviously it's like the element that we know the most to be in this state of flow, and like the stream itself is used a lot in poetry and literature to kind of describe this like this state of flow which is like continual. And for me, the body itself is like this representation. And I guess that in Eastern philosophy specifically, it talks a lot about the body as this space for like a stream of consciousness to flow through. And that's something that, for me, this image of rivers wanderer really encapsulates, and that kind of famous quote of like, no man steps in the same river twice, because it's not the same river and he's not the same man. And yeah, I became really interested in a philosophy called phenomenology as well. I did quite a bit of research into it for my dissertation, and the philosophy basically is this description of our being defined by our environment, and we can only understand our body through the environment that we experience. It is its direct experience. That's all we are. And I think it's a very liberating and beautiful kind of way to see the body. So yeah, I don't know, sorry, I think I went on a tangent there.
No,
I don't know if
that's
answered your question. But
it was just more to kind of get your thoughts, and it's also a nice pun with the idea of stream of consciousness, and then you have this stream, literally, or river, or something like, and I was curious if you were thinking a lot about perspective and this other kind of almost contradictory thing, because when we look at a painting, we're always sort of looking out, and classically it's a horizon or a window. And so this thing of looking down, I mean, do you know the paintings of Lucida Hurtado?
That's crazy. I wrote my dissertation on her work.
Okay, yeah, exactly. And totally, you know,
I know them very well.
Good, yeah. I mean, I thought your work kind of beautifully references that idea of changing how we can see, and how the body can almost like come in the frame in a different way, and what that would mean for representation, and a sort of like a classical idea of where our eyes go. And
yeah, totally. Like, it's so funny that you made that connection, because I wrote my whole dissertation about those I am paintings of her looking down at her own body, and that is how we experience our own body, but the female body hasn't really been depicted in that way. But that kind of looking down perspective, like that kind of almost bird's eye perspective, it's this intimacy to it, which I love. And I want my work to be about this relationship between our own bodies and ourselves and our own bodies, really, because I think that we're quite disconnected from our bodies today, and I think that is one of the most important things, is this like reconnection to our bodies. And for me, that painting is so about that, you know. It's such a physical thing, the actual substance, but the actual like the movement of painting, and like the process of painting, it's all about that kind of reconnection with our bodies, and I think
that awkwardness too, right? Like, I think what's nice is you haven't shied away from the awkwardness of capturing something or of looking again and again, and how that may produce a more, you know, like not chaotic necessarily, but a more fractured prismatic image. And I like how you have the patience in this painting too, with kind of the strange outlines or the auras, like the smudging. It's quite a confident depiction of uncertainty and paradox. And I thought that's also really intriguing, because you keep looking, and you almost wonder if it's a dance or if you're just walking and it's capturing it all from a single frame. And even the different levels of painting going on, you know, with the foot in the top left is a little more rendered, or you feel more flesh, when the other ones feel more like maps. And then I kind of wonder if I keep seeing glimpses of other parts or perspectives. So I kind of I keep looking. I think I figure it out, and then I look again, which is also me going back to the image in a way, repeating the footsteps.
Oh wow, thank you so much. That's so lovely. Yeah, I think that kind of like in and out of focus thing is something that I really want to improve on with my own painting, but it's something that I feel like that painting did sort of achieve. And it's so similar to life itself, that kind of in and out of focus feeling.
Do you think that a lot of that that kind of the emotion conveyed in that comes through transparency, like, which is something that oil paint can do really well? Because we can actually segue by looking at this one, which is also really amazing to me in the way that you're working with a kind of transformation, you know, this idea of like a kind of roots or veins that then explodes. So even in a fixed image, you have almost like a before, after, or heading towards, or a volcano, an interruption over a figure, and the feeling of earth or dirt. So like an element of, you know, the complication of the oil paint itself, trying to ever make a form, and then a kind of metaphor or a bigger idea that the brushstroke could convey through this maybe micro or macro reference to systems that are impossible to depict in any way except by like a clunky gesture.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I was thinking a lot about the diagrammatic in this piece and in other pieces that I've done, and how painting there is that bridge between like this quite poetic abstract idea that painting can only, maybe imagery can talk about, that has relationships with like those those like abstract processes that science itself talks about. And I guess like there's, I don't know, that when you talk about transparency, do you mean almost like the reflection of, or sorry, what do you mean exactly?
Well, for example, in the other painting, because you're dealing with water, you've already built in this idea of a kind of a glass or transparency, and the idea that it's a surface that we can see through. So So it's almost like the metaphor is built in to the technique, you know, like transparency is something that we aim for in our lives. You know, we want it in politics, we want it in emotion, and also something oil paint can do. So there's this nice kind of meeting. And in the other work, there's also this feeling of the impossibility of paint to actually do anything. I mean, I'm saying that in an interesting way, the way that painting is this materiality, that it's from the ground. You know, when you're looking down at your feet, you're looking down, and here it's almost like that idea of pigment, or the sort of the weight of material that is always going to fall short of trying to communicate these really overwhelming ideas. And yet in that loss and in that quote failure, something other and poetic and beautiful can be sort of come through. It's just maybe unexpected, you know? I mean, is that how you felt with your process with these ideas about roots?
I think that's so interesting, that how painting does have limitations, and there's always that frustration in the making of painting, of like conveying something, or like this relationship between the representation, maybe like the symbolic in this image, and the sensual aspects of the image, like the actual material itself. And that's something that I think about quite a lot, and how like there's always I don't know, I guess there's something of the illustrative, like it's illustrating an idea beyond itself, but then it's something in itself as well, and then in that sense it's created something new altogether. And that kind of like, you know, like striving in the process as a painter, I guess it's this continual search, isn't it? And if you found it, then you wouldn't keep going with it. You kind of, because you never find it, you always keep going. And that's sort of like a broader reflection of humans, I guess, trying to work everything out all the time and never quite getting there.
And having to use these other forms, you know, so it's like you're always translating or something. And it's amazing, even in this kind of small sort of painting, how many ways you can see phenomena, like you're saying, lightning or roots or volcanoes and flesh and earth, and there's still even layering here. It's just done in it's an opaque layering. So the feeling that, you know, that there's a kind of layers that you can't see. You know, it's interesting that both paintings they're such opposing methods to try and disrupt or show process or time.
I also wondered about the scale, because this one's quite a bit smaller than the previous one. The other one's, I think, 160 centimeters tall. So its relationship to the body and to feet in particular is completely magnified. It's sort of for the viewer, obviously we're just seeing it on a screen here, but the viewer is kind of diminished. Do you want to talk a bit about the difference in terms of the scale and how that impacts the paintings?
Yeah, I think over lockdown I was doing quite a lot of the smaller works that about the scale. All of them were 20 by 25 centimeters, and I began to like really develop a connection to making work at this scale, because I guess it became really intimate, and it became I kind of saw them like almost archaeological objects, like that kind of like a fragment of like tile or something that you might see in the British Museum from like ancient Pompeii, and it has this like this sensuality about it because it's so small and it draws you in. And I became interested in how when you're at the scale, the body is involved very much so, like even because it does activate your body in a different way, and also the kind of, when it's at the scale, someone mentioned this to me, only one person can stand in front of that painting like and see it directly in front of them at a time, instead of like with a larger painting maybe you've got like 2 or 3 people standing and experiencing the same sort of perspective on the painting. And I thought that was like a really nice thought that kind of it can be this window of another dimension, which is really personal experience for one individual and
more intimate. Yeah,
and
it's
also like
Imogen, like wondering if this scale, I mean, you've worked on drawings of scale, but because of lockdown, you massively had to change the size you were working at as well. And I wonder if that opened a new avenue for you, as Matthew's kind of picking up on. And maybe you wouldn't have done this if we hadn't locked down and we hadn't had to leave the studios. I don't know. It's been a really interesting development in your practice.
I really think lockdown sort of made me pursue this smaller work because of the kind of restrictions, and also like I guess we all felt it over lockdown. We didn't feel like really, like yes, like like open and wide, and like we wanted to like like spread our wings. We were being confined, and we felt a bit more humble maybe, and in a bit more of an internal space. So it just seemed to fit more with like psychologically, but also like the physical space aspect. And I think that the universe sort of like creates things for reasons, because I think if I'd said like in the Camberwell studios, I would have continued to try to make like really big paintings, like, and I always visualize the degree show being like lots of big paintings, because that's sort of what you see like most of the time these days with degree shows. And but I'm actually I'm really glad that it took me down this avenue, and it's something that I began to like actually really value, and seeing this very small scale in relation to the large scale as well. I know you can't see it on the PowerPoint, and it's something you can only really experience with them in real life, but I think that has a really interesting dynamic.
Imogen, I'm really sorry, I'm going to have to be timekeeper, but we can we can circle back, but you guys jump in as well if you want to add comments. And but yeah, thanks Imogen. We're gonna move on to look at George's work next. So Matthew, I think you were taking a more closer look at George's work, and just wondered if you want to offer some thoughts.
Yeah, hi George. Hi. I heard you did this over lockdown as well. So yeah, I'm really intrigued by it. It's one of those things that you first see as an image and then really have to zoom right in to get a sense of what you're looking at, because you're looking at the label which says acrylic on canvas, but on first glance you look, it's like trompe l'oeil perhaps. It's that kind of, you're not sure what you're looking at. But my presumption is that the work on the right is a painting. Am I correct? The Do Not Double Stack?
Yeah, so
Yeah,
so I found the thing on that. So I found this hardboard kind of, I guess, packing something or other, and actually kind of 3 years ago or so. And I guess I have a similar story. So I use found objects quite a lot. I have a similar story to Imogen that, I had it all set up in my studio. I was like, okay, we're going to go for it. And then suddenly lockdown happened, and it's harder to find objects when you're kind of stuck at home, kind of thing. I kind of just found this, and I'd always liked this label that says "Do Not Double Stack," and you just think, yeah, no, I will double stack it. Like,
yeah.
But I never quite figured out how to do it. And then I had this idea of kind of doing a copy, and then changing the USA to Made in UK to kind of refer to stuff, etc. It's actually, so it's acrylic on canvas. And then I molded, I made a mold out of Mod Rock that says the same size and same shape, because it's got this kind of curve because it's so old. So it's basically, it's kind of trying to be a facsimile, I suppose, although the painting is kind of not quite there.
Yeah, and the painted side, I mean, you end up kind of doing a spot the difference as well. Once you've twigged that one is different from the other, you start to notice things like the painterly quality of a natural staining on the label, what then references perhaps gestural painting or abstract expressionism. And then you start thinking of colour field when you start zooming in on the browns and the slightly mottled darker browns and so on. So, I mean, were you consciously thinking of the painted side in any sort of dialogue with those histories of painterly languages?
I mean, I guess I had in my first year at Camberwell, I'd done, so I wrote an essay on Jules Olitsky's, the big, whatever 3-meter thing that was in the Tate at the time, that big kind of pink, I forget the name of it. I'm kind of, I guess that just that kind of pleasure of paint, which to me is a lot about kind of having almost like a single flat plane that then has all these like marks. So not necessarily color field, but just kind of how you cover a big surface with color. But actually, there's a lot more as you kind of dig into it. So I guess that's in my head. This was just kind of a bit more context. I guess this was one of the first paintings I'd done for maybe 6 or 7 months. So I started off doing some paintings. Then it tended to be quite kind of object, make an object, make a thing around it. I guess it kind of hit me that a painted response would be the kind of the thing here. So there was a touch of, there was almost a touch of desperation, I guess, it being locked in, like, oh God, I got nothing to do. Like this will probably work. But I also quite like, so the double stack, the text, I traced it and then I cut it out with masking tape, and it was horrifically, it just took a long time and it's a bit rubbish. But I kind of quite like that in the end. I think if I'd have been in Camberwell, I would have screen printed it, whatever.
Okay.
I quite like the like ham-fistedness of it, I guess.
Yeah, I think it would lose, because it's kind of got those different layers. There's definitely a humorous side to it, which perhaps if it was screen printed or printed, or if there wasn't a slight wobble on the letters, you'd lose that sense of the individual hand to it. And actually, even the fact that it's placed on this floor with a sort of, those little patterned tiles as well, all gives it this sense of something domestic, something perhaps a little bit abject as well. Obviously only exists in my mind as a photo, but how would you want people to come across it? Is it the sort of thing that gets activated by being in a gallery, and at first glance you might think it's the real thing, just leaning against the wall of a gallery? Or can you even imagine other contexts where you'd want people to come across the work and be puzzled by it?
Well, so I had this, my proposal for the degree show had this kind of set this up as, and the point about domestic was something that was in my head quite a lot. And it kind of set this up as there's this kind of room, and I had this idea of, it's kind of not for humans. It's kind of, they reference a lot of human things, but it's kind of objects for objects a little bit. So this was supposed to be, my head, it was in the room next, like a side door. So it's like the package you're just about to, you've packed it up and you're going to take it out to wherever it is, you're going to send it off. Sorry, I've got a cat coming in. So I don't know. I think it kind of, I hadn't really thought that much about, where it, what physical space it gets presented in, because I just feel that's not kind of the vibe right now. Can
I ask you a question, George?
Sure.
I'm just wondering, do you know the work of Robert Gober?
Yeah.
Because part of me wonders, like, do you need the real one? And if you just had the one that you've reproduced, the sort of uncanny quality of, is it real or not? Because maybe in juxtaposition with the real one, you would notice the painting qualities more. Do you see what I mean? Like,
yeah, I guess, and just to, like, where it came from was this kind of, this like slightly bloody-minded feeling of like, I want to find a way to double stack this. There's this thing that is just lying on the street, like shouting out this order to anyone who looks at it. And I kind of wanted to like not do that, basically. So I think that's almost like the genesis. That's what I was thinking about. So I think Robert, I wonder if it was the cat coming in, that because I think he does like the kitty litter. Is that Robert Goby? He's
Yeah,
made
he
like,
does lots of sort of, remaking by hand an object that is industrial or that has significance, like very loaded significance, but sometimes you can't really understand until you just have a feeling that it's not industrially made. You know that it's handmade, but it takes a while, and it kind of loads the object with a totally different energy. And I wonder almost if you had them in different rooms, even like how someone would do a double take, and that could be a form of double stacking.
I kind of feel like they need to be the painted one kind of needs to be, as you said. I'm not sure you'd put the painted one on its own, but it might be interesting to have them in different parts of the room. Because I think the first one is kind of quite important to contextualize, or to give some context to the second one, painted one. But yeah, maybe it's. Perhaps in a physical degree show, I would have been able to kind of play around with it a bit more.
George, I was going to say, when it comes to like them being together or apart, I think it would be really interesting having them in different rooms. Because like Alison said, basically then you would still have like this contextualization of the painted one, but instead of kind of having this immediate comparing the two, you would have to like go back and forth, which I think would be like really interesting. But I agree with you in terms of like I really like the connection between the two of them, because I've never seen you like do something like this before. And when I saw the piece in the PowerPoint that we got sent beforehand, I was like, immediately I was like, this political, which is like something that I've never seen from you before as well. So I found that really interesting.
Same. I think it's I'm curious as to know why you found one like made in the UK and one made in USA, because I think you could have just replicated it completely, but obviously you put made in the UK, and I don't know if that's a political commentary or if that's just because you have literally just made it in the UK.
Yeah, is it something about like Brexit?
No, it's just the thing. I made it in the UK. And I kind of, but there was also this idea of kind of how goods move around. I guess I think quite a lot about Heinz Steinbach and this sense of kind of the circulation of goods, which was another kind of thing that was kind of slightly more degree show. And it's kind of dumb. Like, this was made in the UK, this was made in the UK, because like it obviously was, because it's a Campbell degree show. But then it kind of talks to like, there's a kind of an Atlantic between these two objects. So it's kind of dumb and literal, but it also seems to, at least in my head, was something around, these kind of found objects that start in the US and come over, and I have this thing about found objects, how you kind of, like how they move around. So they kind of, it starts and it gets broken and it gets thrown away. But then there's this kind of weird, like second life or, resurrection, that now suddenly it's not there. It's starting some other thing. So, I guess that's
something political that Chelsea was touching on, I think, as well, of this idea of, you were saying, do not double stack. And you're like, I'm going to double stack. I'm going to refuse what I've been told to do here. And then you see the flags of USA and UK. And immediately you're thinking about protesting against not doing the thing the country is telling you to do. So there's another messaging that's going on that I wondered if you,
if I don't mind, sorry.
It's all right.
Especially with the fact that like with Brexit and everything politically at the moment, there's a lot of people saying, oh, we're just going to become a cheap knockoff of the USA, or we're going to become like mini USA. And you've just practically done that with a painting, like an imitation of the real thing. And I think that's quite, I don't know, that's immediately where my mind went.
That's a really beautiful analysis, actually.
I had the same thought in terms of it's an imitation. It's like a poor imitation of the USA, and in a way, I think particularly now with Boris and Trump, who are both, they like giving orders, and the fact that Boris is often compared as a knockoff version of Trump. Boris is compared to Trump. So
it's like the other thing masquerading or trying to be as good as, or the knockoff. What Paul just said, I just that line, I'm like, that should be the title of the work. As really, yeah, I hadn't kind of clicked into that, but I couldn't help but see this messaging of countries and orders and doubling, and I was just feeling very like maybe I wasn't welcome even in the room with this work, like do not, and it just felt kind of quite confrontational, and I guess that's
Very,
why
like,
I'm quite attracted to it.
Yeah.
Propaganda.
Esque, yeah. It's like, because it's got such this like strong message, and like I'm obviously it wasn't just me that had like immediate connections to like politics, so yeah, it's just like very like aggressive. It's like a piece, I think.
But then I also see this kind of strange tenderness, because it's all the work to reproduce it, and all this hand labor and careful painting, and to me that's such a tenderness to take trash or refuse or something discarded and labor over it. It's almost like this artisanal approach against the way the world functions, and it's almost like art's absolute goal is to be totally useless, you know. And here you're really taking that to this almost poetic position, because we know that you can feel that it, and when you read the materials you're like, whoa, there was a mold involved, like this is labor. So I kind of like that contradiction, that again, not being able to see it in person, just from that list of materials I could feel the tenderness.
Yeah, I agree. It was really good to see the materials. Sorry, Matthew. Sorry.
So the next work as well, because that's a very different piece, isn't it? The one with the banister and the colours. Yeah. I mean, it's a really intriguing one, because also there's no words, no immediate recognisable object, and you start thinking of things like, you know, something in an interior decoration context, or those color swatches that you see when you go to DIY stores, or a color wheel, or even a mirror or a frame. I was wondering what your references and thinking were behind this piece.
So it was for this, I think so it started off actually with a little support, and I've kind of found this support. It's kind of L-shaped. I don't think I have one to hand. And I just was quite intrigued by it. I started kind of playing around with it. Then the kind of banister came in, and I started to have this idea of like this interior life of a banister, if you like. Like, wouldn't it be cool if actually it was something kind of like a stick of rock kind of thing?
Yeah.
And I think previous to this, because I use a lot of found objects, so it's quite hard to get color in. You know, they tend to all look basically brown or black. So I just thought it'd be kind of neat to see if, you know, if I could like, I had the idea of color, then I was like, but actually wouldn't it be cool if like the color's like changing? So in my head, what I'm implying is that throughout this, if you cut at any particular point, there'll be, you know, a different shade, because this is some kind of, you know, this is there is a color wheel like inside this kind of banister. I just happen to be showing you these, whatever, I think it's 18 things. And yes, it was more around kind of making the everyday object is something kind of that supports you, whatever it is that you touch a lot, but you don't really think about, kind of making it a bit strange and kind of trying to inject some, you know, magic in it or something.
I think it takes it back to its living wood quality as well, because of course if you cut any wood on a branch, it has coloured sap of some description inside it, whether it's, you know, bright green or murky, and yeah, it makes you think of the fact that these pieces of wood are completely ordered and organized and regular, but obviously they used to have all the idiosyncrasies of nature, and then they've become homogenized, but in a way you're reclaiming that that homogeneity by adding the color.
It's interesting because I sort of thought of a Ferris wheel. And that's like this, there's this playfulness there through that suggestion, but then you say like about it being this kind of like cleaned up, repurposed material, which originally would have existed in nature as this organic structure, and it's like humans kind of like interpretations of fun in the like Ferris wheel and the fair, it is quite kind of like I don't know, like can be, well, it is mechanical, like they are mechanical structures, but we use them to have like fun. And then I don't know, the color wheel aspect of it as well, it's like a reference to this natural structure, this color wheel, but then it also at the same time has this reference to like interior design and color swatches, and then being quite like rigid kind of interpretations of that. So like maybe it's this interesting relationship between something kind of natural and something mechanical,
or something functional, you know, something that you hold on to so you don't fall down the stairs, versus something just to be looked at and thought about.
Yeah.
When
it
I
makes me think of the Duchamp work In Advance of a Broken Arm, the snow shovel. There's something about that that's connecting. So the idea of the snow shovel being there so that you can remove the snow so someone doesn't fall over and slip and break their arm. They've moved the snow shovel and put it in the gallery space. You've taken the banister and put it in a gallery space. So it's something about that, just thinking about grandparents in lockdown and going up and down the stairs, and suddenly you've removed this really important thing from a home. It's quite comical, I guess, and then it's really colourful and celebratory at the same time. You're celebrating a very boring banister. You know, it's quite bizarre, but it's really playful. I agree with what Imogen's picking up on as well. I'm being a bit of a timekeeper again. We have to go to the next person, but we can. Luckily, Zoom has given me an extra 40 minutes for free. It just texted me, so we can keep going for a bit. So let's move on. Thanks, George. Let's move on to talk about Paul's work. So Alison, were you taking a look at Paul? Yeah, okay.
So I was also really intrigued by the two works. Maybe we can flip back and forth, because I
sure.
think
Yeah, of course.
They both have this kind of element of alienation and of something, of a symbol sort of taken out of its context, or, I mean, they're two very different ways of doing it. But for example, with the one with the car, you've got this silver foil and this kind of element of fetish or, you know, suspension, and a kind of like dream object liberated from any form of advertising or reference point, almost just floating in the unconscious. And obviously the title makes me think that, you know, it's indexing something, but it's also being removed, and there's a very kind of haptic quality to this kind of observed and felt and touched, manipulated surface that is sort of, you know, paint is flung around it. There's a kind of obsession quality I find. It's kind of mysterious in its graphic choices. And then in the other one, again, Paul, I would like if you could even explain a little bit, just to make sure that I know what I'm looking at, because I'm assuming there's a light physically lighting the photograph. Where it's cut out, or is there real wood? Was the wood the frame?
So it's a photograph which is made from making this side of a model house.
Okay.
And literally just, it's like a little constructed set that I made and pieced together.
But there's a real light bulb.
And there's a real light behind that.
Yeah.
It's like a little doll's house window that's been placed on this board, and then there's like a white box behind that with a light underneath.
Okay, yeah, that's what I had assumed. And again, it's almost this like miniaturization, or this like dollhouse thing, like you say, with the car and the house and all these symbols of peace or prosperity, but then they're sort of turned on their head with this really striking alienation energy, or the absence of a human presence. And with this one, I even, you know, I think a little bit about Edward Hopper and these kind of ways in which solitude is expressed. And obviously it has a different context when you know the date that things are made now, and your title. So maybe you could just speak a little bit to the choices of symbol, or the idea of something indexing the unsayable.
So, I mean, this is from the house, and this is a larger body of work that I was working on, looking at the American home and the idea of a house. And through continued study of that and looking at that imagery and research and various different things, I kind of started to think of the house as the body, or as a vessel for the self. And then I started to think about four walls and what each kind of four wall represents. And one of those walls for me was connection. And this kind of speaks to that state of connection, or what does it mean to connect? What does it mean to long, or to possess, or to be within something? And yeah, but at the same time, a lot of it is also linked into my memory as an English kid watching American television and growing up and seeing all these classic American films where you're constantly seeing American architecture, or this very specific style of an American home. And also this notion of that, one day you're going to grow up and you're going to have a 9-to-5 job and you're going to have a mortgage and you're going to be able to have that. But then obviously 9/11 happened, the 2008 recession happened, and all of these things, suddenly my generation finds ourselves in a very different marketplace and in a very different world to the one that I was shown in film or popular culture of my youth. So the title of that kind of stems from that notion of, looking back at those memories and looking back at the hope and the positivity contained within those moments, but also using them for the future, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, no, it does. And also this idea that the surface of whatever the artwork is, if it's a drawing or if it's a photograph, that you want to disrupt it. Like, I'm curious about this strategy of disrupting, so putting in the light or putting in the foil, which is a kind of reflective material that is also, I guess, something about luxury or
I think
metal. Like, how did you see those elements?
I think some of that comes down to like iconoclastic nostalgia, and it's kind of taking those tokens or those icons and breaking them apart or deconstructing them, reinterpreting them, and with the other work, the study of American muscle, that was like something kind of new that I was experimenting with there. So that's like why I called it study. Because literally studying the materials and the techniques involved in making that, and again, just deconstructing it, playing around with it.
But the two works have a very different, almost like boundary. The other one is so modeled and ordered, and that one, right? And then the study feels like you're trying to scratch or maul or take apart this image, and it's a much more aggressive, I think, of like the combined techniques of Rauschenberg too, like it's really American muscle-y kinds of macho ways of affecting a pre-existing image or something. So do you feel that there was some sort of frustration with an image that's so withheld, like the way the one with the light one?
Completely. I feel like the house, it's often seen as a sanctuary. It's seen as a very different symbol, whereas the car, specifically American muscle cars, the symbolism within that is inherently toxic. And so I felt with this, I was scratching away at it. I was wanting to destroy it. I was wanting to kind of deconstruct it and almost fight with it in a way.
But then also make it precious with
in a way, right? Or to kind of put it into a certain dreamlike state where it again is kind of like that thing of iconoclastic nostalgia and changing and subverting the meaning of it and making it into something else.
I think they both definitely have this like dream like quality, like you said, Paul, and we've spoken about your work before, and like I just have to bring up like the references to Little Shop of Horrors again, because like it's just so like that. Especially the house is just, it's like this, like literally within your work, like the American dream to like own this like white picket fence, these like white paneled walls, and then kind of like the deeper and darker kind of like mystery underneath all of it, and kind of how we're like fed this pipe dream of like that families can be so happy and like perfect, but then there's so many issues like underneath. And I think both of these like really convey that, but in like completely different ways, which I find really interesting, because this is obviously, like you were saying, a lot to do with like toxic masculinity, and kind of it's like the classic like American dad figure, but like the toxic version, like rather than the wholesome version. And then
but there's also there's no figures, you know, they're so noticeably like without the protagonist or the actor in it. And to me they feel like you're really engaged in a kind of construction of atmosphere and an affect. How do you think about those kinds of
Definitely, I definitely think that's something that has started to appear within my practice is atmosphere, condition, effects, and I think the next stage for me is to inject a person into that, and to bring the human and the human body and the human presence into it.
It might be worth, looking at Gregory Crewdson as well. I thought of Gregory Crewdson's large-scale photographs with people in, because certainly that sense of a soaked atmosphere is something that comes across. I mean, I was intrigued though that without people as well, you really get a sense of the human within both of them. And in a way, I guess with the other one, it would be the light and the domesticity of the scene. And then the one with the car, I think just the mark making as well. You get a sense of your touch, which again translates to the sense of it being a car that's lived in, that has a relationship to the body. I'd say sure, try figures, but I'm also intrigued in how, in a way, you're doing something that Gregory Crewdson does without figures, if you like.
Yeah, I think paint is really interesting. I mean, it kind of goes back to a little bit of what Imogen was saying about, how paint can convey like the touch and human emotion. And I think that's a really interesting thing, whereas like photography, it can only kind of go so far, but painting has another quality to it. And I did this over lockdown, and just something I wanted to try and bring in.
It could also be about ways in which you could disrupt the photography. I'm thinking of this piece by Janine Antoni where she suspended herself and she sort of inserted her own body inside a dollhouse. I don't know if you know that work. I can find the name. We can put it in the chat. And this way where, scale is also comes up against the body or comes up against experience, and the play becomes much more sinister when contrasted with maybe something that is very direct for you, because the pull that these images from childhood or the pull that nostalgia might have for you seems also like something that is important for you to question and almost undo. The stories around it could give you a lot of content about why it's so attractive. In fact, it's not anonymous at all, So there's this contradiction of having images that are sort of almost emptied out vessels for what we can project, and then there's your direct connection and the associations that you bring to them and that intensity. And I would be interested to see how you can, there's a lot of content there, and manipulating that in and like giving and withholding in regards to the viewer, that could be very productive.
Yeah, I think that's something as well that I've just started to look at is narrative and storytelling and those kinds of things, and just that cinematic experience of film and the relaying of images and things. Yeah.
It's interesting what you're saying about paint, Paul, as well, and what paint can do that other things can't do. But it feels like even photography is not enough. It's got to have the light source in it. It's got to be it's a physical rendering of a photograph. But I love the way you're actually calling them dioramas, and the degree show you would have done, was very much going to be forming an installation that the viewer could be consumed within, and, really put those ideas of nostalgia and the future that may never be in play very, very directly. But I think this form of working with diorama is really exciting. New move for you, especially as we move into a time when space and time and leaving the house is going to be difficult to do. And I always talk about Joan Jonas, but the way that Joan Jonas has started to make dioramas, because she couldn't be in multiple places all at the same time, so she started to make performances in dioramas with using film. And I just, it's just a really exciting move in your work. Realizing you couldn't do a physical presentation of your exhibition, but you've done this, and that's quite exciting what you're talking about, what paint can do, but photography not doing enough, and therefore it needs to be this plus this plus this plus this.
Yeah, and I think that's going to be interesting to experiment with. With the car paintings, I started with an image of a car that I photographed and printed that onto canvas, and then painted over the top of that. And I'd be interested in taking that further, and why not taking the photograph of the house that you've made and then painting over the top of that and creating more situations. But,
and that idea of archaeology and digging into something as well. A photograph maybe doesn't allow that, but making it physical rendering does.
Yeah.
And I think there's an interesting colour language as well, with the sort of the rich blues and that woody orange in the next one, which I think when talking about atmosphere, colour plays such a part in it. So even just purely explorations of the gradation of tone, the lovely modulations you've got in tone there, towards the bottom left as well, and also the color relationships. I think there's a lot of rich painterly ground there.
I was just thinking with with the cars as well. When I was looking at them, I was thinking it reminded me of when a billboard has been like eroded over time. And the second one is slightly more, it looks like flaked paint. And it has like a weathered appearance to it. And I was sort of thinking, like, recently I've just been, like walking around London, and all of the posters from like that were put up in February for festivals in March and the summer are still sort of all up, because obviously because of COVID and lockdown, they haven't been taken down, and those events never really happened. And I don't know, it kind of like just brought that thought up in my mind.
I think we need to move to the next person, Paul. But thank you for showing us those. There's two things that, there's so much work I haven't seen in reality, and I'm really looking forward to seeing in the future. But it's great to have this time to look at things today. So we'll move on to Chelsea next. So Matthew, do you want to kick us off with your thoughts?
Yeah. Hi Chelsea. I saw the video that you sent as well, with the sort of the fish. Exactly, and the text, and there's a lovely sense of real direct personal communication with the viewer. Do you want to talk through a bit, because obviously you can't watch the video, about what you say in that piece?
So in the Worst Aquarium Ever 4, basically it was merged with a poem which was called Oranges and Mint Imperials 2. And it was actually, that was probably one of the last poems that I wrote, and it was quite interesting because usually, like, when I write poetry, I'll leave it really raw and like untouched, and I won't rewrite things. I won't go back into things. I'll leave like misspellings. Whereas this one, it was a second draft of an original poem. So yeah, it was kind of, I spoke about basically my memories of being in restaurants with my family, and like very like visceral things that come back within memory, like smells, touch, and kind of the connections I had with like aquarium fish, which are so ingrained in my mind as something so relevant to kind of Chinese restaurants that I would go to with my family. And I'd kind of spent like the hours there just like staring into the like abyss of like these aquariums, which has like this very strange, like both positive and kind of like negative memories for me. So yeah, and then that's kind of, I guess, also portrayed through the way that I've filmed these fish lanterns with like these kind of badly rendered aquarium backgrounds. I actually filmed the snippets of video on Zoom using like the green screen button. So yeah. Yeah.
No, what I really got from both this and then the performance piece that there's this still of is the sensuality as well of that experience where you're talking about, you know, the sweet stickiness from the orange. There's I actually watched a couple of the other pieces on your channel where you're crunching the cookie, or somebody is eating one of the cookies itself, and I think the sense of touch, tactility, smell, taste, in a way they've taken on a completely new meaning since the coronavirus as well, in terms of that very direct bodily contact, the way that you've got somebody reaching into a basket of something, going to take it out, potentially going to eat it, surrounded by people. How do you feel about how this was filmed, or this was documented in February, that shift in terms of how your work is perceived and read and received given our current crisis?
I think it's been like a very, very strange shift because not only because of coronavirus has this like change within like contact between people happened, and like food, like that whole relationship's changed, but also the relationship with racism towards any Eastern Asian kind of person, not even just Chinese, has really like had such huge influx. So I found it very like strange and kind of like pertinent how this kind of happened during this time, and like how it kind of affected my practice. I have like a piece of work that was like a direct response to COVID, and like how my aunt told me a story about a specific situation she had like at a bank, where a woman like raised like her scarf over her face when she saw her and like started being very rude to her. So it really did affect like the way I was kind of thinking about my work generally. And when it came to like consumption, I think it was really interesting, like you said, because now we don't have this like kind of relationship like we did with food. I think especially in London, people are so used to eating out and like being in contact with people all the time, so that really changed.
Yeah, no, definitely food culture. And actually, if we were able to zoom in on this PowerPoint, I was reading at the text that's printed onto that, and one of the lines says, "My skin is white but tinted yellow. People say I look exotic. That is a manifestation of Eurocentric ideas of beauty," which I think, again, given all that we've been discussing in the last couple of months, really, around Black Lives Matter, about, you know, societal division, I think it all adds an added poignancy, I felt, in terms of your, you know, quite a playful and generous exploration of these, but I feel there's quite a sharp point to it as well, which I think is really intriguing.
Yeah, I think I was glad to kind of put, so that poem that I wrote, it's a very like long poem. It was like the whole length of the 2-meter tablecloth, and it was like the first poem I wrote that was like a direct kind of like divulging into my feelings around and my bringing up around my like ethnicity. So I'm glad that all happened kind of before this, so that I had a chance to like explore my feelings around it whilst it's not like in a height of kind of a lot of backlash towards my ethnicity. Like it was nice to be able to do that before and then kind of have like a solid ground.
Yeah, I hear you.
Yeah, I was also kind of intrigued by your choice, like the poetry and the choice of titling, and how important language is to frame things, like to frame performance, and how you would want like the tone, you know, like it's very ambiguous, that title. I keep wondering, you know, what could you mean by that? And I sort of wonder, how do you think of poetry as being both a kind of form of disclosure and then also a game, or a kind of like to make this sharp point. How have you been seeing language sort of serving or hindering these purposes for you?
I think, yeah, with poetry, like you said, it's always kind of got this open to interpretation thing, because whenever anyone reads or looks or kind of listens or views anything, they always are going to put their own personal experiences and like kind of inject them into it. So I find it really interesting. When I did this performance, it was really interesting, the different kind of reactions from different people, and especially like depending on their race or age was also quite interesting. So I had like one girl that I really didn't know very well because she was on a different course, but she was Chinese, and like she finished reading the poem and then she like came up to me and like hugged me. She was like, "It's okay," which was like a really interesting response. And then, yeah, I think it's, when it comes to how the text is like viewed by different people, and I think specifically with this poem, it was very kind of like, these things have happened, these experiences have happened, and it was like all laid very bare. So I think with this one, it was like very obvious. Whereas the second poem, which is the film one, that one was a bit more kind of like ambiguous, I think. But yeah, with the title, I'm not Chinese enough to actually be Chinese. I feel like, again, it's one of those things that's like obvious, but then also it's also got this open to interpretation thing where it's like, obviously, I think it just mirrors like the fact that my race itself is like ambiguous, like racial ambiguity. So I think that's like the direct link for that. But yeah, I don't know what other people think. Obviously, it's really interesting hearing how other people like perceive it.
It's interesting with performance as well, Tosi, because often the title of a performance might not be as clearly displayed as it might be in a press release or even a wall label, you know. And so that titling you could find other ways maybe to show it. Perhaps maybe it could have been in every one of the fortune cookies, or there might be other ways to play with your titling and your writing to bring it to the fore more. But myself and Alison and Matthew had a quick chat before we started the call, and we were saying you can't even imagine a performance like this being ever able to happen really now. Look how close that person is to your body, and how your practice will probably really, really change in terms of performance. Do you want to talk a little bit about the masks that you've been making?
Yeah, so when I went home actually before lockdown even happened, and so I got stuck there really, back to my mum's home, and I was kind of like lacking in materials, but I had all these scraps of these like brocade fabrics, because I used to stretch deconstructed cheongsams, the Chinese dress, onto like painting frames, and so I'd have like scraps. And I basically started making like face masks to wear out of these materials, which was like really interesting because I had a very mixed feeling around them, because I was like, I feel strange kind of like imparting them with the world, like giving them out to people, because it's this idea of like appropriating the fabric, which happens a lot with Chinese like clothing and fabric and other like non-Western clothing. But then also I spoke to Sarah Kate about it, and it was kind of also this idea that it's it's a performance wearing them out in public, because you're like being very obvious with the fact that you're supporting Chinese culture or Eastern Asian culture, and not supporting, I guess, the racism and like the hatred towards Eastern Asian people during COVID. So yeah, I mean, that was interesting, I suppose.
Yeah, I think it's just a really interesting way of the way performance might have to shift in this new world. And I think when we saw those masks that you've been making, and especially because of your sister working within the NHS, you know, it was just another way of thinking, how can I deploy the work to make something keep working. I thought that was
I think it's about like displacing myself out of the performance for some things as well, which I was thinking about during planning for this performance. I was like thinking of ways that, oh, maybe I could do this performance, but I won't actually be involved in it. So I think it's just kind of thinking about that, and like
that's also why that's also why I brought up, or was intrigued to know more about the poetry practice, because you know, text is the most portable form of material, and the way that it can migrate across these different surfaces. And you know, even before you said like you sort of laid out the text, literally you did that on a tablecloth, like these parallels of sort of laying out your thoughts and the surfaces that the words can find themselves on can be really productive, and it could be really simple. So I think the even repetition of text, or how it can be the same text on different surfaces, or how a poem kind of gets transmitted, that to me is very performative. And there's so many options with kind of text-based work. So I think that part of your work is really strong.
Thank you.
And what's the and the personalized fortune cookies, do they have individually written messages within each of the cookies that people take away?
Yeah, so they had 5 different messages, and each were a kind of like anecdotal story about either microaggressions or like very obvious racism that had happened to me growing up, or even before I was born. So for instance, and all of those anecdotes are basically within the poem, so they are the things that fueled the poem. So for instance,
they extracts from what's on the table as well, or are they additional to the text on the table?
No, so they're the anecdotes that are within the table text, but they're like written in specific ways. So it's like, when I was this age, this happened, and this happened. So for instance, like one of them was like, when I was born, my mother's family told her that she just keeps on making white babies, so that it would be like within that kind of framework.
Yeah.
I was wondering, did you have the cookie, like how did you make the cookies? Like, did you go to a company that makes them, or just?
I looked into making them myself, because it's, well, basically, if you want to open up a fortune cookie and then reclose it, you can open them, steam them, because then they become soft. Then you can insert your own messages and refold them and then close them up. But I printed like 500, I think, cookies. So I got them like professionally done, where you can choose your messages. You can, like, a lot of people buy them for like their weddings and things, so you can do them on like websites like that. But yeah, so it was like a bit of an investment, but I was saving money for the midget show for this. So yeah.
Imagine a sort of form of takeaway art as well, where it could be delivered to the recipient's door. There's all sorts of new possibilities, I guess, whether it's mail art or some kind of sharing and gift giving, which I think could still be explored in this new context.
Yeah, well, a few people told me they'd like taken them home without opening them, and then they opened them at home. And because they didn't know what was going to be inside of them, it was like obviously quite a shock, which I found like that was really interesting, how like the art can travel without me even trying. So
and have a very intimate, just the act of reading, as opposed to say seeing a really big painting, which several people can do. Reading is always that, you know, you're alone unless you're reading out, but it's a really intimate communication. So yeah.
Thank you, Chelsea. I think we'll move to the next person. And do go and see Chelsea's film. Many of you who haven't seen it yet, you can maybe circulate the link later. So yeah, let's move on to Hannah's work. Hannah, we could hear you before, but you're a little bit quiet. So I don't know if you could come closer to the microphone.
Sorry. Is that okay? I can try putting my speakers in.
I'm really sorry to interrupt, but I've got to scoot off to work.
Bye, Paul.
Bye, Paul.
Nice to see you.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Sorry, I've got 30, which it is now. So thanks so much, Allison and Sarah Kate, for setting this up.
That's okay. Nice to see you. Bye.
Bye.
Okay, so Hannah, we can hear you. You're just a little bit quiet. So
Okay. I will plug in my thingy then. That's not a problem.
okay. Well, Hannah, whilst you're doing that, let's move to Mohammed's work, and we'll come back to you. Okay. So hi, Mohammed. I think Matthew, maybe were you offering?
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, I've been looking at these. Hi, Mohammed. Really nice to see, and even I mean, it's obviously the first thing I think of whenever I look at something on the screen is its actual scale. And you know, looking at the image, one would think this must be done with really small brushes and it's a small scale, intense piece. But actually, it's 1.5 meters wide, nearly 2 meters tall. So it's got a real epic impact to it. And you do also think of the physical feat, really, of creating something that's so densely detailed but large as well. It makes me think of a sort of otherworldly landscape when I look at it. It actually got me thinking about almost outer space, old TV series, Lost in Space or something, of these lands which almost look like they've just been seen for the first time by the human eye. I was wondering what your thoughts are in terms of place in this, whether it's for you a real place or more of a place of the mind when you're making this work.
For me, it's more so kind of a place of the mind. It's more of a transformation. So I kind of like to I often look to nature as something that's got emotional resemblance and associations that through paint can be transformed and can instill something beyond the physical image. So the image remains just an image, and you kind of create something that goes beyond that and creates this relationship with the viewer, where the viewer is questioning what it is about this scene and this painting that's not in the actual image. You're not physically seeing these ideas of notions of foreboding and sinister and beauty and stuff like that. It's not something tangibly represented. It's something represented in the details of the decisions made by the artist, by myself, and how I choose to paint, how I choose to create gestures and details. So it's kind of an imagined place, but not directly thinking that I'm creating an imagined place, more so directed by, I guess, a bit more of an emotion, trying to capture a sense of these themes of foreboding, sinister, and beauty.
And I really feel it has a very direct relationship to the viewer, partly also imagining it in terms of its scale, but the sense of the perspective that you get of that path, which feels like you're on it, you're actually there as the viewer, and it leads you in. And as you say, it's those painterly elements which I find really intriguing, that sense of the top half of the painting being more about shape and flatness, and then the bottom half having this quite sculptural textural depth to it, which draws your eye in. And then in the middle, it's punctuated by this sort of brackish mark making, where you really do feel the sense of the brush flicking and gesturing around it. So it feels like an exploration of painterly language as much as image.
Yeah, that's definitely probably the biggest part of my practice, developing this sense of instinct in not necessarily being directed by the image. So the original reference is more of a daytime image, where the little sculpture thing on the bottom left doesn't actually exist, and the water doesn't exist there. That's just houses there. So it's more so so that's probably the biggest part of my practice, trying to create this language and thinking, what can I instill into this painting that kind of directs what I want to put into it, and kind of just using what I've kind of found in the images.
No, that really translates, I feel, the sense of what you said, that that where there's water, and the fact that it's black water, at least it looks it on the screen, is really fascinating. Or the fact that it was day but you turned it to night. Should we look at the next screen as well, Sarah?
Yeah.
Because this as well, I was really drawn in by that sense of, you know, what they call the blue hour, that the twilight hour, where in the distance you've got this sense of the sun has already set, it will be night, and the street lamps have come on, and it really feels about shadow as much as it does about a frozen moment. So sure, it's a young person kicking a ball, but then it's also things like the doubling of the ball and the ball's shadow, the fact that part of the shadow is dark leading up to the person's trainers, and then the other part has got that interesting street lit shadowing as well, and then you've got the sense of the lights coming on or already on in the tower blocks as well. Do you want to talk a bit about how you approach light, artificial and natural, in your painting process?
So I like to I like to be quite almost dramatic. I like using light in my paintings just as a way to move the eye of the viewer around the painting and stuff like that. Especially with this painting, it's such a perspective painting. And with this is quite important just because I want to give it a sense of time, a sense of day. And it's because this painting is mainly a lot about culture, street culture, growing up as a kid, and this idea of innocence and the changing culture in youth. Like when I was 13, I'd be playing in the streets, but I think about street culture now and kids my age in school. There's a big difference in culture, especially where I'm from, and crime and stuff like that. So this painting becomes about innocence in that sense, and I want to all these sort of things about how I use light and stuff like that becomes about story and trying to really tell that story through sort of things, trying to tell what kind of time of day it is, trying to remove the eye around the painting through these little details. I think
you do that beautifully with the title as well, the sort of the double meaning of killing time, which I think kind of implicates the viewer in a really interesting relationship. It then becomes about the subjectivity of the viewer and their subject position in relation to the young person on the street. Are they gonna kind of catch the ball and kick it back to the person, or are they going to swiftly cross to the other side of the road because they see the person as a threat? And I think it's a really fascinating exploration of those things. So it kind of seduces you as a viewer through its perspectival trick, you know, of leading your eye in, but then it absolutely puts you in, you know, you become aware of your body because there's that moment frozen of something coming directly at you. And then also I think the challenge of the title is this person just enjoying themselves and killing time, or is there an element of danger? So I think that's really, really interesting.
Yeah, I'm also intrigued by your framing because the way that things are cut off, there's like a kind of randomness where I think of when photography started to come into painting very early on, you know, when Degas or someone would take a photo and he would show half things, you know, this kind of almost awkward thing to say that you're just panning, your eye is panning across. And so the way that that car is cut, just, you know, the front wheel, and it's not, it's this kind of randomness that I also feel is inside the work that makes it tense, you know, how you're choosing to frame, because even when they're really tightly framed or really constructed, like both of these are paths, you know, where your eye goes, you have these other things that contradict the staging of it or the classical elements. And I would even imagine that you could push that more and more, like kind of the entrances and the exits of the paintings are really loaded. What's happening on the edges, on, you know, how can you almost divert attention from the pathway? to enhance this idea of sort of coming across something, or the ambiguity that comes with these incredibly tonal and atmospheric narratives. And yeah, it just also, it took me a while to even see the ball. You know, I was so focused on the kind of other points. So the slowness of the frozen moment is also really interesting to me, that the painting kind of happens in stages and then all of a sudden I see it. So there's sort of like two time processes or something. And
yeah, that's really interesting, because with a lot of my paintings, one of the main things I try to consider is this opposite of trying to invite in, but then having a stillness. Like with the previous painting, even when I position it closer to the ground as opposed to central, so that it feels like you're walking into something. And it's similar with this. There's sort of like, there's cut-offs in the beginning to create this sort of fast tension, but then there's really still slowness and this contradiction, and almost as if there's something impending.
It's quite filmic, isn't it, as a device, that idea of using peripheral vision, like what's on the edge of the screen. Hitchcock used that a lot in his filmic. But, you know, I really love what Alison was saying as well, the exit. You know, we're looking out for the danger, but we're also looking in, and we're kind of caught in those two spaces. And I can't stop looking at the white van and thinking about who's in the white van constantly. And I think maybe I've just been watching too much crime drama, but I'm really worried about the figure. I'm worried about the person with the ball that's being watched. It feels like someone's watching you, or someone. And that there's something there that it feels quite frightening to me, because of that big looming vehicle that can just move away really quickly. There's something there that I can't help but look at.
Well, I also like that, you know, cars, though they've come up a little bit with Paul, but in Paul's work, the car was very symbolic, whereas here the car is almost so unworthy of being painted that it becomes a protagonist. You know, like to paint car, and you've painted them so well in a way where there's this realism, but there's also the touch. And it's almost like giving this painterly attention to the stuff that we normally don't think of as, you know, painting worthy, if you see what I mean, like it's just a white van or something. But so this kind of this inverse of what constitutes subject matter I really like. And yeah, how the margins are really active in the landscape one. It's almost like it's such a completely different kind of painting. But what I'm interested in this one, how it's so formal. You know, you have like these different shapes kind of crossing your path, and they almost create this rhythm that is really unexpected, because it took me a while again to see the fence. I mean, of course, because I'm not in front of the painting, you know, but like, I feel like you're also dropping these clues about visibility and how it could take a bit of time to see the whole thing, you know, like that the vision comes in stages. And I feel like you could really push that when you're thinking about the four corners of the painting, and how these liminal hours, these transitional hours can almost like reveal something a bit later on through more and more looking, and even repeating some motifs across paintings and creating like a mythology of the symbols or the kind of reoccurring motifs in the work could be interesting to build up on this idea of the random versus the staged, the classical painting versus the street photography, you know, all these sort of contradictions about realism and how we encounter and figure it. Because this one even has elements to me of like that kind of surrealism of Max Ernst, you know, where like it could almost become a weird shape in the front, and it could become biomorphic or something. It's almost like a stage for a whole other genre. And it's interesting if you kind of like hold back on that, or if you go for that, or if you corrupt the photographic element, or if you go more in this biomorphic abstraction. So it's a really interesting place that could go in so many directions.
And actually, a painter that this put me in mind of is Ange Smith, A-N-J, Ange Smith, who creates small other worlds. They've got this almost old master painterly feel to them, but often they've got really textured elements built up. And the other person it put me in mind of was Hervin Anderson. Hervin Anderson's done this incredible nocturne painting where it takes you quite a while to make out any shapes at all. It's almost like a black painting, but it's got a street scene in it. So yeah, there's in a way you're like Allison was saying, almost create world building through this painterly language as well. So yeah, repeated motifs, places, characters could be a really rich pursuit there.
I also I'm just looking at the killing time, and I'm really fascinated by the shadow of the figure and the ball, and like the relationship between how the shadow like falls and then goes into that lime green and then cuts into that bottom shadow, and then that kind of abstract relationship of shapes, and how that kind of those elements of the painting are quite different to the more, you know, like very realistically, almost like photographically rendered elements of the painting. And also like I'm just like zooming in because I'm finding like I'm seeing so much in the details, like the wire, which is almost like a spider's web. It's just like catching the light glinting in that against that blue, deep blue in the sky. And yeah, I just find that I'm finding that relationship between those slightly more kind of abstract but like phenomena, I guess, like that's happening on the street, and like the buildings and the person, and how that's a very kind of real relationship that we experience in urban environments, like I guess like natural phenomena like slipping in and forming those human kind of happenings in those environments.
Yeah, I know what Sarah Kate said like about it like being scary, but for me like that kind of time of night, like I might be going off somewhere to to go to a party or something, so like I get like a really like a positive feeling from it. I guess I didn't notice like the person kicking, I didn't notice the ball there and its shadow, but also I can't remember his name, there's a painter who does paintings of like suburban neighborhoods, and they're you know, it's so ordinary, but they do just look so beautiful, like the lights and George Shaw, it just does look kind of magical, but then it's just like completely ordinary street.
You might like Narby Price's paintings as well. Narby Price.
Yeah, I quite like the idea of seeing the abstract in it, because that is something I do try to look at, like trying to make small decisions in trying to make the ball look more spherical, and something playing between its shape and a ball, and like not continue the shadow of the lamp of the telephone pole while continuing the shadow of the person instead, and the wire is almost looking like taking the perspective of a roof that's getting a bit too much down in perspective, almost like that. So creating this unseen urgency, and again that similar sort of questioning of, it's a very still scene, but there's something kind of off about it, but where does that lie, and trying to make that lie in their subtlety as opposed to the direct things that you can see.
Well, you're doing it very well. So they're really great paintings, Mohammed.
Thanks.
Okay, let's go to look at Hannah's work now. Let's start with this one. So Allison, do you want to kick it off?
Yeah, it's also interesting that we already mentioned Ange Smith, because I thought about her.
Yeah, I love that as well.
Yeah, as a reference. But I was also very intrigued by the list of materials in this case, and kind of wondering where you stand on the idea of accelerating the rot of the painting. I kept thinking about almost as if you're implying that the object is doomed to decompose, and the decomposition that's rendered pictorially is also implied in the materiality. And if that was, I mean, to me, that's the kind of the content and the form being in this sort of union, and especially with the other one where the mushrooms are coming out of everything, this sort of, that's the other one, like this fungal persistence, and how mushrooms can grow. They're like this life form that can grow out of total decay, and anticipating and accelerating the decay of the artwork. I found it almost kind of funny. I know that it's intense, and it also has these religious connotations, which I'd love you to talk about, the relationship to altarpieces, and this kind of really, considered history of worship and memento mori, and how we try and memorialize life. We're trying to anticipate death, and in a way you've anticipated the death of the object already in the object, and it's like you're trying to put forward its second or afterlives, or its various ways in which it's connected to materiality. So I sort of like this almost futuristic, accelerated decomposition, this almost like post artwork implication that I'm looking ahead to the future of this work already having become part of the earth and regrowing, or like being reborn. So this idea of afterlife or life and death, to me, I'm really seeing it as something organic that goes beyond a human. It's almost like a post-human position. So
yeah,
maybe you could, yeah.
I guess I was like torn between, like, I've always been torn between, having an object that I can then, it's like a piece of art, and like a lot of art, people like restore it and they keep it something for hundreds of years. But then I also like the idea that just exploring that everything's temporary. I think I had the idea to make a drawing and then actually have mushrooms grow out of it, so it was completely destroyed. So it was something that would take me hours to do, but then mushrooms would just eat away at it, and it would just then I could probably like cook the mushrooms and eat them or something. But then I guess I'd probably would have wanted to make a film of that, but then it's also interesting just like freezing it in time and making these mushrooms, and I guess they look quite similar to real mushrooms. I went to Somerset House mushroom exhibition, which was like in February, and there was an artist who went to Camberwell called Hamish Pitch, and he does he makes like these little toast stacks with mushrooms coming out of them, or like these stacks of pure white paper, and they've got mushrooms going out of them as well, but they were just sculpted, so it's like frozen in time.
In one of my, sorry, go on.
Oh, I was just going to say about like the religion aspect. I guess I was like, my whole thing was it was making like a new religion, which was less. So it was kind of reminding people of their mortality, but without so much the stories of Jesus and things. If that makes sense. So it was more like making a new pantheon of like mushroom gods, and that will return to decay. But like, it's not something you have to be scared of. Kind of don't fear the reaper, kind of thing.
Mushrooms are kind of scary, though. I was going to say that in one of my university student apartments, we had mushrooms growing in the room, and I didn't know, because there was a leak from the radiator, and I didn't know that mushrooms can grow inside on the wood from, we were so scared. We thought, oh my God, there's like life forms being generated, and at the same time, there's a lot of sort of, philosophy around mushrooms now, and quite a few books are being written about how mushrooms can hold all these secrets to renewal, and they are seen as this almost, aside from the general interest in psychedelics too, like what mushrooms can do to your mind, it's also how they can persist in all these environments. So I kind of feel like the mushroom part could be exaggerated, or like I also wonder if you know the work of Annika Yee, and her materials lists are pages long sometimes of really ephemeral things like smells or gases or scents, like kind of along the path that you're going to, where's the vinegar, or where's the coffee, where's the soil. Like I question, and I know I would probably obviously have more clues if I could see the work in real life, but even then, how are these things going into the work, and maybe to bring in some of the mysticism or the cultish aspects, you could have things in your materials list that you can't see, or are more, imaginative. Like maybe the site of the materials list is also where you could play a little bit with this idea of not being afraid of compost or second life or something.
Really interested in how you've actually drawn, like the style of your drawing in the face and the altarpiece, and it kind of, maybe it's quite a random connection, but it made me think of Giacometti's drawings, and he's such a different kind of artist to you, and the time is so different, but his kind of whole work was about this almost like dehumanization post-war, like disassociation with the body, like existentialism, and that was almost like the future of then. And I wonder if that's like an interesting connection, because it's almost like, do we need like a dehumanization in terms of like a return to the organic world, but is that actually like a rehumanization? It's like a reconnection to essentially our what we are is very, like, we have so many relationships with like the fungal world, and that's like that's why they're so, it's seen as such a healing plant. And obviously so much discovery has been made through kind of fungi, and it's one of the like base organisms, which then led to the construction of our very complex organism. And the very linear quality of the drawing is almost like vein-like, and it's almost like this web, and that kind of ecological aspect of the work. And I'm interested in how the drawing sort of seems to reflect that.
I guess like I'm interested in like the tension between the kind of like, it's really nice to be alive and be like whole and stuff, but then I'm also just really interested in like anatomy and like when things go wrong with the body. And I think it's fascinating how like I got this book called The Sick Rose, and I had like I made like these little sculptures of leprosy, like the leprosy things on patients. Like obviously it was from an illustration, so it was already an artist's interpretation, but I'm also a bit weird, and I like going on Reddit on like these medical gore subreddits. It shows all these horrible things that have happened to people, and it's just it's really cool seeing that it looks so similar to maybe like sea creatures, like things growing on rocks, and it looks like sometimes it's like mold, and even like veins inside of us, maybe it looks like roots in a tree. And it's like, I guess we for the most part are kind of disconnected a bit from that. Like maybe the whole coronavirus thing, so many people dying around us has maybe brought that back to our attention a bit, that we are kind of at nature's mercy, really. And I think people had kind of forgotten that, and maybe that's why people aren't taking the pandemic so seriously. They're like, oh, it's just a virus, I'm not going to wear a mask. But it's like, you will die, you can die, these forces are a lot stronger. Like we can think that we're like invincible humans now because we've got antibiotics, we've got vaccines we can make, we can wash our hands and things. And only like 100 years ago or so, I think it was even like 100 years ago, we didn't even have an antibiotic. So like if you got a little bite from an animal and it got infected, dead.
No, it's like a reminder of our mortality.
So it's now like I'm quite into like just the fact that funeral places, funeral parlors, they can really swindle people out of their money, because it's really devastating when someone dies now, for the most part, because we're so unused to it. We're not like, it can't be like, oh, Johnny got a bite and they got infected, oh, okay, we've got 10 other kids maybe. I mean, it's not exactly like that, of course, like that would be sad, but people like have their money stolen off them by funeral places because they're like, oh, you need this and this and this, and it'll be £50,000, £50,000. Yeah, I don't know if I'm rambling, but yeah.
With that point, with the funeral directors, yeah, I found it really horrific, but like I guess interesting. With obviously with COVID, with the mass amount of people dying, so many people unexpectedly who don't have like funeral plans in place,
Cool.
then the families don't have money to pay for their funerals, so these people aren't getting proper burials, and then it's like this link between kind of with a lot of religions and a lot of cultures, if you don't have a proper burial, like you don't get to kind of have a peaceful afterlife. So that's quite interesting. And I like with as well with the religion kind of aspect of the altarpiece, that's kind of connected to this like afterlife idea, because with like, are these people like they're part alive, I guess, because they're part fungus now in the drawings. So yeah.
I think it's like I do want to explore a bit more. Like I had done some research into like how death is, how people relate to their dead around the world, and like I found it really interesting how I think it's, you know, in Mexico, like with the Day of the Dead, in some, or I can't remember exactly where around the world, but they actually get out their mummified dead and they just chill with them. They just have like a party with them, and they're just like, oh, this is your great grandfather so and so. And I just think like if you do that to someone in my culture, they're going to be like, oh my god, like what are you doing? But that's just normal for them, like for some people. And it's also been the norm for a lot of history and around the world that people would have their dead in the home when they die, but now it's like, oh, lock it away in a cold box, pump it with formaldehyde. Like there is no, I think there's this idea of like a proper burial, but like for a very long time people do that at home. They just dig a hole in the ground. Like you could put, like, you don't need like, you know, a big coffin that has lots of, you know, paint and stuff that will leach into the ground and harm the earth. But, you know, you can just put them in like a nice box that's going to mold away or like burn them. But yeah, it is, I guess it's different, like with, you know, want to make sure that no one's been murdered or anything. You do have to like make it official.
I mean, that's to do with like the westernized ideals of like what death means and the hatred and like scaremongering of what death is in the West, which a lot of it is because it's like profited off of. And that's like a very Western idea. Like you were saying, there's a lot of Eastern cultures, and I think in like South America, every year they rewrap their dead family in like new silks, and they like bring them out and dance with them. Yeah, so it's a very different culture, like surrounding what death is and kind of the hatred and like around it.
I think it's very interesting the idea of death in different cultures, because especially in my culture, well, religiously, you often find that we're not as, well, I've seen with my parents, they're not as like the idea of mourning. A lot of the time you see goes on for supposedly like weeks, months, it could be a year, whereas religiously and culturally with us it's very quick. Like when my mom's mother passed away, it was just maybe a few days she was really upset and they moved past it. I think she lost a sister and two brothers in the last few months, and she gets past it really quick, and that's something that occurs a lot in my kind of culture and religion as well, just because of beliefs and stuff like that. It's really interesting the different kind of practices, and the like Western culture really, there's such a big difference between them and how they treat death, I guess.
It's like the celebration of someone's life versus like the mourning of someone's death, which is like a very literal East and West parallel.
Yeah, definitely.
The art object also its function has been so often to kind of process or anticipate or commemorate the unseen, which is I guess what death is. So there's also, I mean, it's interesting how, or the way in which painting has been mobilized to kind of confront these things, especially given in the Western history of painting, the such close links with church patronage, which is why the shapes that you're choosing are so, for example, in this altarpiece one, they're so immediately referential to one kind of tradition. And in a way, like, in my mind, because you're actually interested in very alternative views on this, I would almost expand out of that framing and sort of, discard those structures because they're so imposing. And even the way that they're so heavily bounded, like their boundaries are so heavy. Like, to me, the mushrooms is the moment that you're kind of able to break out of that, and that's the most interesting bit for me.
I think, however, there was, I partly read it as well as a decay of some of the old Western forms and structures. If you look at the next image as well, with the architectural, that's very much, referencing architecture from hundreds of years ago in the West, the whole setup. And for me, I partly read it because we've mainly talked about the body, natural decay and so on, but here I actually saw it as something of a cultural decay as well, that it might partly be a comment on the old forms of the altarpiece and the old master aesthetic of drawings. I mean, how do you feel about that reading of the work, Hannah?
No, I think, I like that, because I guess I do struggle. Like, I think the forms are really beautiful. Like, I think they are also kind of like in churches, they are based on like sacred geometry kind of thing, and things that you find in nature. And it feels like Christianity and Western religion were really trying to, they place themselves over a lot of pagan festivals and beliefs, just kind of tried to supplant that and suppress it. But I like the message that, nature does just take over, and that's not going to win. This kind of human control of everything just can never win.
And I think that opposition between the pagan, the nature, and then the constructed, organized cultural power as well of historical Christianity, I think. But they are sort of twin paths, and as Allison was saying, if it's the bodily, the fungal, the natural attrition, then that's a whole world to explore. And then there's this other very contextual world of the historical connotations, and I think they're both interesting paths, rich for exploration.
I totally agree. I think just push those materials, Hannah, like let things grow out of the radiator. I had a radiator like that as well as and you wonder what's living inside the water, but it's the water dripping and reacting. But I love that idea of kind of dismantling different, making your own culture, I guess, or making your own belief system or geometry in some way. It could be really exciting, making your own language, your own world, a little bit like what we were talking about with Mohammed's paintings as well. I think we should draw today to a close because we've talked for about an hour and a half rather than an hour. But it's been a really fantastic conversation, and I just really want to thank the students for sharing their work with us, but also to our guests Matthew and Allison for being with us today in this virtual realm, looking at things we would much rather be with in physically in the studios. But thank you. Does anyone want to end on a comment or say anything to finish, or
I just want to say thank you to the both of you as well, because it's been really great.
Thank you.
Really inspiring.
And I think just nurture all this through whatever the months ahead come. You've got to practice, which is really exciting, and just grow it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, well, I'm going to stop the sharing of my screen now. I'm going to